In 1978, more than 900 members of a religious community in the jungle of Guyana died in a single day, the overwhelming majority of them by drinking a cyanide-laced beverage at the instruction of their leader. What has continued to trouble researchers studying this event in the decades since is not simply the extremity of the outcome, but the ordinariness of the people involved. The members of the People's Temple were not, for the most part, individuals with pre-existing psychological disorders or unusual personal deficiencies that might explain their susceptibility. Many were educated, socially connected, psychologically unremarkable people who had, over a period of months or years, become progressively more embedded within a group whose demands escalated gradually enough that, from the inside, each individual step rarely felt like the dramatic capitulation it would appear to be from the outside. This case, along with a substantial body of subsequent research on cults, extremist movements, and more ordinary forms of costly group commitment that fall far short of the Jonestown extreme, points toward one of the most powerful and most double-edged forces in human psychology: the need to belong to a group, a psychological drive so fundamental and so deeply rooted in human evolutionary history that it can, under the wrong conditions, override self-preservation itself, and that, under more ordinary conditions, shapes the overwhelming majority of human social behavior in ways most people never fully recognize. Understanding where this drive comes from, how powerful it actually is, and why it can persist even when group membership becomes actively harmful to the individuals involved, illuminates something fundamental about the deep structure of human social psychology. Let's begin with the foundational research establishing the belonging need as a basic and universal feature of human psychology. The psychologists Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary, in an influential 1995 paper that has become one of the most cited works in the history of social psychology, proposed what they called the belongingness hypothesis, the claim that human beings possess a fundamental and pervasive drive to form and maintain a minimum quantity of lasting, positive, and significant interpersonal relationships, and that this drive functions as a genuine psychological need, comparable in its basic motivational structure to physiological needs like hunger and thirst, rather than simply a preference that can be indefinitely deferred or substituted without meaningful psychological cost. Baumeister and Leary's extensive review of the existing psychological literature found that the need to belong satisfies several specific criteria that distinguish genuine psychological needs from mere preferences. It produces effects that are largely independent of other motivations, meaning people seek social bonds even when doing so provides no other tangible material benefit. It produces strong negative affective and cognitive consequences when unsatisfied, including elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and cognitive impairment, specifically associated with social isolation and exclusion. And it shows evidence of a satiation point, meaning that beyond a certain threshold of stable and secure relational connection, forming additional relationships tends to have diminishing motivational significance, exactly the pattern that would be expected of a genuine underlying need rather than an unlimited preference. The evolutionary basis for this need has been documented extensively by the anthropologist Robin Dunbar at Oxford University, whose broader research on human social cognition, which we have touched on in earlier videos in this series, examining the evolutionary basis of laughter and language, has proposed that the human need for group belonging reflects the fundamental ecological reality that, throughout the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, survival outside of a cohesive social group was essentially impossible. An individual human, lacking the specific physical adaptations for defense, speed, or self-sufficient foraging that many other species possess, depended almost entirely on group membership for protection from predators, access to shared knowledge about food sources and environmental hazards, and the cooperative division of labor that made survival possible in environments that would have proven fatal to an isolated individual attempting to survive alone. This evolutionary account helps explain a specific and consequential feature of the belonging drive that connects directly to the extreme cases with which this video began, because group exclusion represented, for the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, a threat of comparable severity to direct physical danger. The psychological and even neurological systems that process the threat of social exclusion appear to substantially overlap with the systems that process physical pain and physical threat, rather than being processed through entirely separate psychological machinery specific to social concerns. This overlap has been documented directly through neuroimaging research conducted by the psychologist Naomi Eisenberger at the University of California, Los Angeles, whose landmark research using a simple computerized ball-tossing game, in which participants were led to believe they were playing with other real human participants who eventually began excluding them from the game, found that social exclusion reliably activates the anterior cingulate cortex, a brain region also centrally involved in the processing of physical pain, and that the degree of this activation correlated directly with participants' self-reported subjective distress at being excluded. Eisenberger's research, which has become foundational to what researchers now call social pain theory, proposes that the human brain evolved to process the threat of social exclusion using substantially the same neural architecture used to process physical injury, precisely because, across the evolutionary history in which this system developed, social exclusion represented a genuinely comparable threat to survival. This neurological overlap between social and physical pain helps explain why the psychological drive to maintain group belonging can, under sufficiently extreme conditions, override what would ordinarily seem like more basic self-preservation instincts. If the threat of social exclusion is processed by substantially the same neural systems that process direct physical danger, then an individual facing a choice between an action that risks physical harm and an action that risks social exclusion from a group on which their sense of security and belonging critically depends, may experience these two threats as psychologically comparable in a way that a purely rational cost-benefit analysis would not predict. The specific psychological mechanisms through which groups escalate commitment and progressively increase the personal cost of continued membership, a process directly relevant to understanding cases like Jonestown, has been examined extensively by the social psychologist Robert Cialdini, whose broader research on influence and persuasion has documented what he calls the commitment and consistency principle, the well-established finding that human beings show a strong and largely automatic tendency to behave in ways consistent with commitments and identities they have previously and often voluntarily adopted, even when the original justification for that commitment has become considerably weaker or when circumstances have changed substantially since the commitment was first made. Cialdini's research proposes that this consistency drive, combined with the well-documented psychological phenomenon of escalating commitment, in which small initial investments of time, resources, or public commitment make subsequent, larger investments psychologically easier to justify and harder to resist, creates a specific and predictable pathway through which groups can progressively increase the demands placed on members without triggering the kind of resistance that an equivalent demand, presented all at once to a new member with no prior investment, would predictably produce. This mechanism, sometimes called the foot-in-the-door effect in the broader social psychology literature, has been documented across an enormous range of contexts, far more mundane than extremist cults, including ordinary consumer behavior, political mobilization, and organizational commitment, but it appears to operate with particular power within groups that additionally leverage the fundamental belonging need that Baumeister and Leary's research has documented. The social psychologist John Turner, whose foundational work on social identity theory we have referenced in earlier videos examining social comparison, has documented a further and specifically consequential mechanism through which group belonging can persist even under conditions of substantial personal cost. The phenomenon of identity fusion, in which an individual's personal identity becomes so closely merged with their group identity that threats or harms to the group are processed as threats or harms to the self, and correspondingly, actions taken on behalf of the group, even personally costly ones, are experienced not as sacrifices imposed from outside, but as authentic expressions of the individual's own deepest values and sense of self. The psychologist William Swan at the University of Texas at Austin, whose research on identity fusion we touched on briefly in an earlier video in this series on why humans follow rules they disagree with, has documented that identity fusion is a particularly strong predictor of willingness to engage in extreme self-sacrificial behavior on behalf of a group, including behavior that directly conflicts with an individual's prior stated values or ordinary self-preservation instincts, and that this fusion tends to develop most readily under conditions involving shared, intense, and often difficult experiences, precisely the kind of experiences that many high-demand groups, whether extremist political movements, cults, or in less extreme forms certain intense organizational cultures, deliberately or inadvertently cultivate among their members. The developmental and clinical psychologist Alexandra Stein, whose research specifically focuses on the psychology of cult involvement and the process of disengagement from high control groups, has documented that the specific pattern of intermittent and unpredictable reward and punishment that characterizes many high control group environments, in which affection, approval, and belonging are provided inconsistently and unpredictably rather than reliably, produces a psychological attachment pattern that closely parallels what attachment researchers call disorganized attachment, a specific and particularly difficult to escape attachment pattern in which the same figure or entity that provides comfort and belonging is also the source of threat and distress, creating a psychologically confusing bond that proves considerably more difficult to sever than a bond based on either consistent reward or consistent punishment alone. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention because it addresses a question with significant practical and clinical implications. What specific factors distinguish individuals who successfully resist or exit high-demand and harmful group involvement from those who do not? And what this reveals about the conditions under which the belonging drive can be redirected toward healthier expression rather than exploitation. The sociologist and cult researcher Yanja Lalich, who has conducted extensive research on high-control groups drawing partly on her own personal experience of cult involvement and subsequent departure, has documented what she calls the bounded choice model, proposing that member commitment within high-control groups is best understood not as an absence of rational decision-making, the popular but empirically unsupported model in which cult members are simply irrational or brainwashed in some crude sense, but as a specific pattern of rational decision-making operating within an artificially and progressively narrowed set of options and information, in which the group systematically restricts members' access to alternative perspectives, alternative relationships, and alternative sources of meaning and belonging, such that continued membership genuinely does become the most rational available choice, given the constrained option set the individual actually perceives themselves to have access to. Lalich's research found that successful exit from high-control groups is most reliably predicted not by the individual's general psychological strength or resistance to influence in the abstract, but by the specific preservation or reconstruction of an alternative social network outside the group, a finding that connects directly back to the fundamental belonging need that Baumeister and Leary's research identified as the underlying psychological driver in the first place. Individuals who, even while embedded within a high-control group, manage to maintain some degree of ongoing connection to family, friends, or other social relationships outside the group, retained access to an alternative source of belonging that made the psychologically costly process of exit considerably more viable than it was for individuals whose social world had become entirely contained within the group itself, a finding with direct practical implications for how families and communities can most effectively support members who become involved with high-control groups, emphasizing the maintenance of relational connection over confrontation or the presentation of counter-evidence, which Lalich's research found to be frequently ineffective and sometimes counterproductive. This research connects to the broader clinical literature on what the psychologist Stephen Hassan, himself also a former cult member, turned researcher and clinician, calls the BITE model of authoritarian control, an analytical framework identifying the specific mechanisms, behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotional control, through which high-demand groups systematically undermine a member's access to the independent social and informational resources that would otherwise allow the belonging need to be satisfied through a broader and more diverse network of relationships rather than being funneled entirely through dependence on the group itself. Hassan's clinical work has emphasized that effective intervention and support for individuals involved with high-control groups depends substantially on understanding that the underlying psychological need being exploited, the need for belonging, connection, and meaning, is not itself pathological or unusual, but is instead the same universal human need that, directed toward healthier and more diverse sources of satisfaction, is entirely compatible with a flourishing and autonomous life. What emerges from this substantial body of research is a picture of the human need for group belonging as a psychological system of genuine evolutionary depth and power, one that evolved to solve a real and evolutionarily critical survival problem that is processed through neural systems substantially overlapping with the processing of direct physical threat, and that can, through the specific mechanisms of escalating commitment, identity fusion, and inconsistent reinforcement that characterize the most extreme and most harmful group contexts, become powerful enough to override even an individual's basic self-preservation instincts. There is one further dimension of this research worth examining, because it addresses the question of what specifically distinguishes ordinary, healthy group belonging from the specific pathological pattern that characterizes the most harmful cases. A distinction with significant relevance, given that this video has focused substantially on the extreme end of a psychological continuum that also includes the overwhelming majority of entirely benign human social experience. The psychologist Alexandra Stein, extending her research on high-control groups specifically, has proposed a useful distinguishing framework centered on what she calls the presence or absence of what attachment researchers term a secure base, the capacity of a relationship or group to provide genuine emotional security and support that does not depend on continuously escalating demonstrations of loyalty, compliance, or sacrifice. Stein's research found that healthy group belonging, including intense and highly committed forms of group belonging, such as those found in demanding but non-exploitative religious communities, military units, or close-knit professional teams, is characterized by a specific and measurable feature that distinguishes it from the pathological pattern found in high-control groups. The relationship between individual and group remains fundamentally responsive to the individual's expressed needs and concerns, and disagreement, questioning, or eventual departure, while they may carry genuine social costs, do not trigger the specific pattern of escalating punishment, information control, and manufactured crisis that characterizes the high-control groups Stein's clinical research has focused on. This distinction connects to a broader body of research on what the psychologist Arieh Kruglanski at the University of Maryland calls the need for cognitive closure, a general psychological dimension capturing individual differences in the desire for firm, unambiguous answers to important questions and a corresponding discomfort with uncertainty and ambiguity. Kruglanski's research has documented that periods of significant personal uncertainty, including major life transitions, unresolved grief, or a broader sense of meaninglessness or lack of direction, reliably increase susceptibility to groups and ideologies that offer strong, unambiguous answers and an unusually clear and totalizing sense of belonging and purpose. Connecting the specific vulnerability to high-control group involvement, not to any general personality deficiency, but to ordinary and near-universal periods of heightened uncertainty that most people experience at some point across the life course. A finding that Kruglanski's broader research program has extended to help explain the demographic and situational patterns observed in recruitment to extremist political and religious movements more broadly, beyond the specific case of cults in the narrower sense. What this body of research collectively suggests is that the line between the ordinary, adaptive expression of the human belonging need and its most extreme and harmful exploitation is not a difference in kind, but a difference in the specific structural features of the relationship or group in question, whether it maintains a genuine secure base that remains responsive to the individual, and whether it exploits periods of heightened uncertainty to offer a totalizing and difficult-to-question sense of belonging that becomes progressively more difficult to exit as commitment escalates. The events at Jonestown were not the product of some rare and inexplicable form of mass psychological failure, disconnected from the ordinary psychology that governs everyday human social behavior. They were the extreme and tragic expression of exactly the same fundamental drive toward group belonging that, in its far more common and far more benign forms, motivates you to maintain friendships, remain loyal to your family, feel genuine distress at social rejection, and organize an enormous proportion of your daily behavior around the maintenance of the social bonds that, for the entire span of human evolutionary history, quite literally determined whether you lived or died. The drive to belong is not a weakness that occasionally, in rare and extreme cases, gets exploited by dangerous groups. It is one of the most powerful and most fundamental forces in human psychology precisely because it was, for nearly the entire history of our species, one of the most reliable predictors of survival available, and the same depth and power that makes it capable of tragic exploitation under the wrong conditions is the same depth and power that makes ordinary human community, friendship, and belonging one of the most essential and most protective forces available to a human life under the right ones. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.